In 1944, as the skies over Europe turned into one vast battlefield, a single aircraft began to rewrite the rules of air combat. Sleek, silver, and impossibly fast, the American P-51 Mustang became the scourge of the Luftwaffe. German pilots called it the long-range devil, a plane that could appear from nowhere, escort bombers deep into the Reich, and still have the fuel to fight. But few Germans had ever seen one up close, until fate brought one down in near-perfect condition. It happened near the French border. A P-51, forced to land after battle damage, was captured almost intact. Within days, it was transported by rail to Germany's top-secret test center, the Luftwaffe's Erprobungsstelle at Rechlin. There, among the hangars filled with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, the engineers gathered around the mysterious American machine. They had heard stories of impossible range, of speed that rivaled jets, of pilots who swore they could dive faster than anything else in the sky. But to the German experts, such claims sounded like exaggeration. Surely this Mustang was just another Allied fighter. Agile, yes, but ordinary. They expected to find weaknesses, compromises, flaws hidden beneath the shiny metal skin. Instead, what they found would leave them speechless. The engineers began their inspection. The airframe was unlike anything they had seen. Clean, minimal, and aerodynamic to perfection. The laminar flow wing, a new concept in design, allowed the Mustang to slice through air with unmatched efficiency. The Merlin engine, built under license by Packard, roared with a strength that stunned even veteran mechanics. One engineer reportedly said, "It feels as if this machine was made to fly forever." Even before testing it, they understood one thing. This was not a typical enemy aircraft. It was an expression of industrial mastery, a symbol of what German designers had always admired and feared: precision through simplicity. But the real revelation came when the Luftwaffe pilots took the controls. Men who had flown Bf-109s, FW-190s, and even the deadly Me-262 jets now climbed into the cockpit of an American legend. They thought they knew what to expect. They were wrong. The first time a German test pilot taxied the captured P-51 Mustang across the tarmac at Rechlin, the entire flight line turned to watch. The aircraft looked alien, its smooth curves, its polished aluminum, its wide stance. Even the way it idled was different. The deep, confident rumble of the Packard-built Merlin engine rolled across the airfield like thunder. It wasn't loud, it was commanding. The pilot that day was Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced evaluation pilots. He had tested almost every Allied aircraft the Germans had captured: Spitfires, Thunderbolts, even a B-17. But the Mustang intrigued him more than any other. He later wrote that from the moment he sat inside, he could tell it was different, not by power, but by design philosophy. The cockpit was simple, almost austere. Everything was where it needed to be: clear, logical, efficient. No excess, no ornament. German aircraft, especially the high-performance fighters like the Me-109, were cramped with levers and dials that reflected complexity and constant innovation. The Mustang, by contrast, felt built for endurance, for pilots who might spend 8 or 9 hours in the air. As Lerche pushed the throttle forward, the aircraft surged to life. Within seconds, the Mustang was airborne, smooth, steady, and balanced. He climbed higher, testing the controls. The stick felt light but firm. The visibility through the bubble canopy was astonishing. The Germans had designed fast aircraft before, but few could match this clarity, this control, this grace. When Lerche banked hard left, he noted something even more remarkable. The Mustang didn't lose energy the way most planes did. It held speed through tight turns, its wings cutting through the air cleanly. The laminar flow design that Allied engineers had boasted about was no myth. It worked. What stunned the Germans most wasn't just the performance, it was the range. Even with fuel tanks half full, the Mustang's endurance far exceeded any fighter in their arsenal. The Luftwaffe had long struggled to escort its own bombers deep into enemy territory. Their fighters, though deadly, could never stay aloft long enough to defend them. The Mustang, however, could fly from England to Berlin, fight, and still have the fuel to return home. To the men at Rechlin, that changed everything. One engineer wrote in his notes, The Americans have solved the problem of distance. They can now fight wherever they wish. That realization sent a quiet chill through the Luftwaffe's leadership. The Mustang was not just another fighter. It was a strategic weapon. It gave the Allies control of the skies, not because it was invincible, but because it could be everywhere at once. As Lurch brought the Mustang down for landing, his hands trembling slightly on the throttle, he turned to his ground crew and said only 4 words: "It flies too well." The test flight had ended, but the questions it raised would haunt the engineers for weeks. How had America built such a machine? How had they perfected it so quickly? And, perhaps most importantly, how could Germany hope to stop it? When the Mustang rolled to a stop at the Rechlin Test Airfield, the engineers crowded around it like archaeologists at a new discovery. They had expected a typical Allied fighter, rugged, maybe effective, but crude compared to German precision. What they saw instead unsettled them. Every inch of the P-51 seemed engineered with purpose. Its skin was smooth, almost seamless, with tight rivet spacing and aerodynamic lines that made even the Luftwaffe's sleekest aircraft look dated. Beneath its wings, the fuel tanks hung like quiet warnings. This was a fighter designed not for short, frantic engagements, but for endurance, for reach. The Germans prided themselves on mastery of aerodynamics, yet the Mustang embodied something else entirely: efficiency. Where the Messerschmitt Bf 109 required meticulous maintenance and adjustment, the P-51 was built for mass production, for quick replacement, for war on an industrial scale. One engineer reportedly whispered, "They don't build like craftsmen. They build like strategists." When the team dismantled sections of the plane, the simplicity of its systems shocked them. The Mustang's cooling system, for instance, the belly-mounted radiator scoop that many German pilots had mocked as a design flaw, was actually an aerodynamic masterpiece. It used the air it absorbed to create thrust, offsetting drag. At high speed, the system didn't slow the aircraft down. It made it faster. To the engineers at Rechlin, this was heresy. No German aircraft had ever been built with such bold practicality. They began to realize that this foreign design had solved aerodynamic problems the Reich's best minds were still struggling with. But the real revelation came from the engine, the heart of the Mustang. When they removed the cowling, the words Packard Merlin were stamped across the block. It was a copy of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license in American factories, and improved. The combination of British design and American manufacturing was something the Germans couldn't fathom. They had always seen the Allies as industrial giants, but technical inferiors. Now, staring at that engine, they began to understand the danger of a partnership that combined both. One report from Rechlin stated, "This aircraft unites what we believe to be opposites: precision and quantity, power and economy. It is, in its own way, perfect outside." The air war was already shifting. Every week, more Mustangs filled the skies over Europe, escorting bombers that now struck German cities in daylight. The Luftwaffe's pilots began to notice. The attacks no longer came in waves of tired, unprotected B-17. The bombers now had guardians, fast, agile, and seemingly endless. The P-51 wasn't just surviving, it was dominating. In his post-war memoirs, one German officer wrote, "When the Mustang appeared, the war in the air changed forever. It was not a fighter, it was a system. It flew farther, fought longer, and returned home while we ran out of fuel." The engineers at Rechlin realized that no amount of brilliance or daring could overcome the cold, relentless logic of American production. The Mustang was proof that war was no longer won by individual machines, but by the ability to build thousands of them. The German pilots had laughed at the Mustang once. Now, even before they fought it, they feared it. When the German test pilots finally climbed into the Mustang's cockpit, they did so with quiet skepticism. The engineers had praised its construction, but pilots cared about how a machine felt, how it fought, how it lived in the air. And to them, no foreign aircraft could match the instinctive precision of a Messerschmitt or the raw aggression of a Focke-Wulf. The pilot who took the first test flight was Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lersche, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced evaluators, a man who had flown everything from captured Spitfires to Soviet Yak fighters. When he throttled up the P-51 Mustang, the roar of the Merlin engine filled the airfield. deep and steady, unlike anything he had heard before. The plane leapt forward with surprising smoothness. The takeoff roll was short, the lift immediate. As the Mustang climbed into the sky, Lurchie radioed back one word: Unglaublich. Unbelievable. Once airborne, Lurch pushed the Mustang to its limits. The control response was light but stable, the visibility unmatched. He rolled, climbed, dived, and discovered that the Mustang's true power wasn't in brute strength, but balance. The plane handled like it wanted to stay in the air. German fighters were fast and lethal, but demanding. They punished mistakes. The Mustang, by contrast, was forgiving. It blended power and grace with something rare in war: endurance. In his report, Lurch wrote, "It does not fight the pilot, it assists him. Even damaged, it remains obedient." At cruising altitude, the test pilot pushed the throttle open. The Merlin engine responded instantly, climbing past 400 miles per hour. The P-51's laminar flow wings sliced through the air with minimal drag. At high speed, the aircraft felt lighter, steadier. It almost glided through its own turbulence. Then came the climb. Lurch pulled back on the stick and watched the altimeter spin. The Mustang rose faster than any Allied aircraft he had tested before. For a moment, he simply let go of the controls, and the plane held steady, balanced by its own aerodynamics. When he landed, silence fell over the engineers gathered on the runway. He climbed out of the cockpit, removed his helmet, and said quietly, "Now I understand why our pilots are dying." The Rechlin engineers documented every detail: the acceleration, the fuel efficiency, the structural integrity. They noted that the Mustang could outdistance almost any German fighter, escort bombers all the way to Berlin, and return without refueling. That range, that endurance, was the key to Allied air dominance. Germany's best fighters, the Bf-109 and the Fw-190, were fast but short-legged. They could only protect targets for minutes before running dry. The Mustang, with its drop tanks and efficient design, could stay aloft for hours. It wasn't just a plane, it was a statement that technology alone could not defeat logistics, and that industry could produce genius as surely as innovation could. The Germans realized that the skies had turned against them, not because their aircraft were inferior, but because their system was collapsing. The Mustang was a product of something they could no longer match: cooperation, standardization, scale. One engineer summed it up in a single, chilling line: "The Americans have turned the sky into a factory." And in that moment, the laughter that had once filled Luftwaffe briefing rooms, laughter at the clumsy American fighters, fell silent. At the Luftwaffe Test Center in Rechlin, the Mustang was no longer treated as just another captured enemy aircraft. It had become a subject of obsession. Every flight, every reading, every engine note was logged and studied. The German engineers and pilots, who had once laughed at its design, now spoke of it with a quiet, uneasy respect. What struck them first was the balance of its design. The P-51 wasn't the fastest fighter in level flight, nor did it have the heaviest armament, but everything about it worked together: aerodynamics, engine efficiency, fuel economy, and visibility. Its long-range capability was unmatched. One test pilot remarked, "It flies like it was born to stay in the sky." The Merlin engine, adapted from Britain's Rolls-Royce design and produced by Packard in the US, stunned the Germans. It performed flawlessly at high altitude, where Luftwaffe fighters often struggled for power. In their own tests, the engineers noted how smooth the throttle response was: immediate, without hesitation, even in extreme maneuvers. One of the engineers, known for his work on the Focke-Wulf 190, wrote privately, "The Americans have achieved what we thought impossible: power without fragility." The German aircraft, though formidable, required constant maintenance and specialized care. But the Mustang was different. Its design was straightforward, its parts accessible, its systems built to endure punishment. Even its landing gear impressed them: strong, wide set, capable of handling rough fields that would cripple a Messerschmitt. Its fuel system, too, was carefully engineered, allowing for extended flights deep into enemy territory, something the Luftwaffe had never prioritized. The Rechlin pilots took turns flying the captured Mustang. Each came back with the same expression: disbelief. "It does not feel like an enemy machine," one said. "It feels like a friend." Another pilot, after a test flight, added quietly, "This plane forgives your mistakes. Ours do not." In that moment, they began to see why American pilots dominated the skies. The P-51 was not built to intimidate, it was built to last, to endure, to win through consistency. It reflected the same philosophy that defined America's war industry: reliability over perfection, production over prestige. For German engineers, the realization was humbling. They had built machines for mastery, intricate, advanced, but limited by their own complexity. The Americans had built machines for war, efficient, standardized, unstoppable. And as the rain fell outside the test hangar, one officer looked at the silver plane and said softly, "Now I understand why they never stopped coming." By the spring of 1944, the Germans had gathered enough flight data on the captured P-51 to draw conclusions that unsettled even the most confident officers. The Mustang wasn't just a new aircraft. It represented an entirely new way of thinking about air combat. In reports sent to Berlin, engineers described the Mustang as an aircraft with no weakness. It climbed faster than the Messerschmitt Bf-109, turned tighter than the FW-190, and could outrun nearly everything the Luftwaffe had above 20,000 feet. Its long range, more than double that of most German fighters, meant it could escort Allied bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, the Reich's heartland was no longer safe. The days when bomber formations arrived unescorted were over. Now the sky above Germany was filled with silver planes, and behind them, hundreds of Mustangs. The Luftwaffe pilots began to feel the shift. In the past, they had been the hunters, diving through bomber formations, shredding their targets, and vanishing into the clouds. But now the hunters were hunted. The P-51s were always there, above, behind, waiting. Veteran German ace Adolf Galland later recalled, "The day the Mustangs appeared, the air war was lost. The engineers at Reckland tried to find flaws, anything that could be exploited. They compared climb rates, dive angles, ammunition capacities. They studied fuel mixtures and stress limits. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. The P-51 was not superior in a single category. It was superior in every one that mattered." One report concluded simply, "It is an aircraft that embodies balance, power, endurance, and stability. It is the perfect escort." To the German mind, this balance was unnatural. Their own designs had always pursued specialization: speed, firepower, or agility, but never all three. The Mustang was the embodiment of moderation in design, and yet it achieved dominance. A Luftwaffe test pilot named Hans Werner Lersche wrote in his diary after flying the Mustang, "It does everything we try to do, but easier." In the air, the difference was devastating. The P-51's Packard Merlin engine allowed it to perform flawlessly above 25,000 feet, while German aircraft began to choke on thin air. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns could tear apart a Focke-Wulf in seconds. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding pilots and fuel, was now facing an enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime, and never seemed to tire. One engineer summed it up in a single, haunting sentence: "The Mustang does not fight the way we fight, it endures." It was a realization that marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies. By mid-1944, the German engineers had completed their tests on the captured P-51 Mustang. The results, compiled into detailed reports, were sent directly to the Luftwaffe's high command. The findings were undeniable. The Mustang was not only an excellent aircraft, it was the final nail in the coffin for Germany's hopes of air superiority. The engineers noted how perfectly the P-51 integrated power and efficiency. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine could maintain a peak performance at high altitude, something the Luftwaffe had struggled to achieve even with its advanced Daimler-Benz designs. It could fly faster than the Bf-109 at 30,000 feet and still travel more than 1,000 miles without refueling. To German pilots, that number was staggering. It meant that Mustangs could escort Allied bombers from England to Berlin, to Leipzig, to Munich, and back again, without stopping. One officer wrote bitterly, They no longer fight battles. They own the sky. The Luftwaffe attempted to respond. Jet projects like the Me-62 were accelerated, and experimental interceptors were pushed through development. But it was too late. The P-51 had changed the nature of the war. It had made daylight bombing viable again, and with it, the destruction of Germany's industrial base inevitable. As the Allies tightened their grip, the Mustang became a symbol of relentless presence. Wherever German aircraft appeared, the P-51 was there. Silent, silver, and deadly. The German engineers couldn't help but feel respect for the machine they had once mocked. The Mustang was not complex. It didn't rely on exotic materials or secret weapons. It was built with practicality, parts that could be mass-produced, repaired, and replaced anywhere in the world. One report from Wrestling summarized it plainly. The Americans have learned to make war through engineering, not through improvisation. Pilots who tested the Mustang in Germany described it as forgiving yet fierce. It responded smoothly at high speeds, resisted stalls, and could dive with terrifying stability. In mock dogfights, even veteran Luftwaffe pilots admitted defeat. A test pilot named Otto Behrens wrote in his evaluation, "If I had flown this in 1940, I would have believed victory was certain. It is the kind of aircraft we dreamed of, but never built." By the time those reports were written, the war had already turned irreversibly. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. The Luftwaffe, short on fuel and men, was collapsing. But the German engineers continued to study the Mustang. Not out of hope, but out of awe. They realized that the real power of the P-51 wasn't just in its design, it was in what it represented. The scale, precision, and relentless efficiency of American industry. It was no longer a question of who had the better pilots. It was a question of who could build faster, fly farther, and last longer. And in that war, the Mustang had already won. By the late summer of 1944, the P-51 Mustang was no longer just a fighter. It was a shadow over Germany itself. Day after day, waves of Mustangs escorted massive formations of B-17 and B-24s across the heart of the Reich. For the first time since 1939, German pilots were fighting over their own burning cities. When the Luftwaffe scrambled to meet the bombers, the Mustangs were already there. Diving from the sun, their Merlin engines screaming through the clouds. The German pilots, once confident in their Bf-109S and Fw-190S, found themselves outmatched. The Mustang could climb faster, dive longer, and fight at higher altitudes without losing control. A veteran German ace later recalled, "The first time I fought a Mustang, I realized I was no longer the hunter. I was the hunted." At the Luftwaffe's test centers, engineers pored over the captured Mustang's performance data. The numbers defied their doctrines. The Americans had somehow achieved what the Germans thought impossible. A high-altitude escort fighter that could dominate both range and performance. They began comparing it directly to their most advanced planes. The Fw-190A could outturn the Mustang at low altitude, but it couldn't match its endurance. The Me-109G had the climb rate, but lost control above certain speeds. The Mustang, meanwhile, held steady, fast, and forgiving. A report from August 1944 concluded, "It has no single area of perfection, yet in total it is superior to any aircraft now in production." As the tests continued, the engineers came to an uncomfortable realization. The Mustang wasn't just an airplane. It was a symbol of a different way of fighting a war. It wasn't about the brilliance of one pilot or the innovation of one designer. It was about cooperation between factories, scientists, engineers, and thousands of workers who could build, test, and ship aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. The Luftwaffe's entire system had been built for elite excellence. The Allies had built theirs for overwhelming efficiency. Even captured Luftwaffe officers began to acknowledge it. One pilot wrote from captivity, "We built masterpieces. They built machines that could win wars." At Wrestling, the final conclusion of the German technical report on the P-51 was simple and chilling. It is the ideal weapon for total war. In the months that followed, German engineers tried to apply what they learned from the Mustang to their own designs. The Focke-Wulf Ta 152 and the Dornier Du 335 incorporated lessons of endurance, power, and fuel efficiency. But by then, the war's end was inevitable. The Mustang had not only reshaped the air war, it had shattered the myth of German invincibility. The German pilots no longer laughed at the American fighter. They watched it in silence, knowing that every silver shape glinting above them meant another piece of the Reich was falling away. By the autumn of 1944, the German skies belonged to the Allies. The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed as an unremarkable foreign fighter, now ruled from horizon to horizon. Its long range and devastating precision had turned the tide of the air war. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, was bleeding out in its own airspace. German engineers continued their tests on the captured Mustang, now studied with a mix of awe and desperation. They had mapped its aerodynamics, analyzed its Merlin engine, and tested its armament. The results told a story that no one wanted to admit. The Allies had perfected the balance between performance and production. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license by Packard in America, was a masterpiece of efficiency. It delivered power smoothly at all altitudes, giving the P-51 a reach that no German piston engine could match. The Luftwaffe had superior engines for short bursts, but the Mustang's engine could fight for hours, thousands of miles from home. One German test pilot reportedly said after flying it, "It doesn't just fly, it breathes. You can feel its strength beneath you, calm and endless." What stunned the Germans even more was the sheer number of them. By late 1944, factories in North America were producing hundreds of Mustangs every month. The U.S. industrial machine had reached its peak. Bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft rolling off assembly lines faster than they could be destroyed. At Rechlin, one engineer wrote in frustration, "We could build a wonder weapon every year." They build an entire air force every month. For the Luftwaffe pilots still flying, the change was devastating. The skies that once echoed with the sound of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs now thundered with the roar of Mustangs. Every sortie felt like suicide. German pilots would climb to meet the American bombers, and before they could even reach them, the Mustangs were waiting. A German ace recalled, "It was as if the sky had eyes. No matter where we went, the P-51s found us." In the cities below, civilians began to notice too. They saw silver aircraft streaking across the blue sky, graceful, relentless, untouchable. The propaganda that had once promised Luftwaffe superiority was now replaced by grim silence. Even the most loyal officers could no longer deny what they saw. America had not just caught up, it had surpassed them. And every Mustang that roared over the Ruhr, Berlin, or Dresden was a proof of that transformation. A symbol of a new kind of power, one forged not in arrogance, but in cooperation and scale. At the end of one test flight, a German engineer was asked what he thought of the Mustang compared to the Me-109. He paused, then said quietly, "The Me-109 was built for a night. The Mustang was built for an army. It was an admission and an epitaph. The war in the air was no longer a duel between equals. It was a storm, and the P-51 Mustang was the wind that carried it." By the spring of 1945, the sky over Europe belonged to one aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. Its shadow stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. What began as a simple escort fighter had become the symbol of Allied air supremacy, and for the German pilots who once laughed at its design, the laughter had long since fallen silent. When the war was nearly over, a small group of German engineers gathered at Rechlin to write their final evaluation of the captured P-51. The airfield around them was nearly abandoned. Hangars damaged, planes stripped for parts, and the sound of advancing artillery echoing in the distance. Yet inside that workshop, the tone was almost reverent. They had tested every aspect of the American fighter, its range, climb rate, roll, and endurance. What they found was not perfection, but balance. The Mustang was not the fastest aircraft of the war, nor the most heavily armed, but it was good at everything that mattered, and that, they realized, was the secret. One engineer wrote in the report's conclusion, "The P-51 represents the future, not because it is superior in one way, but because it has no weakness. It is the weapon of a nation that understands how to build for war." To the Germans, this was the most shocking revelation of all. For years, they had pursued technological miracles, jet engines, rocket fighters, the most advanced weapons ever conceived. But those machines were fragile, expensive, and few. The Mustang, by contrast, was practical genius, simple enough to mass produce, rugged enough to last, and powerful enough to dominate. At its heart, it embodied the industrial philosophy that had defined the American war effort: quantity with quality, speed with strength, and design guided by purpose. When the Allies captured German airfields in 1945, they found P-51s parked beside wrecked Messerschmitts, symbols of two worlds colliding. The Luftwaffe's once great squadrons were reduced to silence, while the Mustangs soared freely over a broken continent. One captured pilot later said, "When I saw the Mustangs above Berlin, I knew the war was finished. No nation that can build like that can be defeated." After the war, some of those same engineers who had studied the Mustang were brought to work with the Allies under Operation Paperclip. They shared their findings, helped design future aircraft, and carried with them a lesson that transcended nations. The technology is only as powerful as the system that sustains it. The P-51 had shown them that true innovation was not about complexity, but about vision, the ability to unite design, industry, and purpose into one unstoppable force. Decades later, veterans on both sides would look back at the Mustang with a mixture of respect and awe. For the Americans, it was the instrument of victory. For the Germans, it was a revelation. The moment they realized that power was not just built in factories, but in the minds of those who understood how to use them. The Mustang was more than a machine. It was a message that determination, when forged with discipline, can outfly even the proudest enemy. The German pilots who once mocked it never forgot what it taught them: that the sky belongs not to the boldest, but to the best prepared. The war ended, but the legend of the Mustang did not. It still flies, a silver ghost against the blue, carrying with it the story of how one plane changed the course of history and silenced the laughter of those who doubted it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.